Welcome to another ZTV. In today's video, I interview Aviva Rosenberg, licensed clinical social worker who specializes in trauma work. I just wanted to hop on before the interview to say that we should all be thinking about donating our money to our local domestic violence organizations. Having been someone who experienced domestic violence, I was fortunate enough to be able to use the services of an organization called Project Sarah in New Jersey, an incredible social service agency that provided me with free therapy for 2 years. Recently, Project Sarah hosted their local fundraiser, which I was able to actually attend on Zoom. They spoke about the new challenges they face being able to support victims of trauma and domestic violence. Organizations like these are seeing a major decrease in the amount of phone calls their hotline receives because most victims are stuck at home with their abusers and can't make the call. When they do receive calls, it's often about how their abusers are hiding masks and other personal protective equipment from them and their children. Shelters for women and children need more support now than ever. They need masks, gloves, and cleaning equipment to remain open and safe. There are a lot of amazing charities out there, and they all need our help. But as I sit from the comfort of my own home with my loving family, I can't help but think about the people who feel imprisoned and unsafe in their own homes. I hope you enjoy this video with Aviva as we discuss what trauma is and how we can overcome it. And I also hope that you all donate to your local charities that support victims of domestic violence. Thanks. Okay, hi everybody, and welcome. I'm so excited that today we have my dear friend Aviva Rosenberg here, and we're going to be discussing trauma and how trauma affects our health and lives in our body. So it's a really important conversation to have and a large one, but we're going to try to keep it focused. So Aviva is a licensed clinical social worker with a master's in social work from University of Chicago. And Aviva, I'm so happy that you're here.
I'm so happy to be here.
I kind of wanted to start going a little bit personal. In my early 20s, I had went through a pretty bad trauma and it really deteriorated my own health. And I something I think about all the time because it's actually what brought me to acupuncture. So all the time people ask me, how did you become an acupuncturist? And that's my first thought is that I went through a trauma, really bad relationship, serious stuff. My physical health was completely deteriorating, getting sick all the time. And then emotionally as well, just anxiety, insomnia, depression, like all of that. And the combination of talk therapy and acupuncture and massage therapy too is for me what really helped me work through the trauma and helps me really be able to move on in a positive way with my life. But that's really how I found acupuncture. And for somebody in my profession, like we know that the mind and the body, it's just one thing. We don't separate it out. And so I feel like you see that all the time as well, probably. So I'd love to hear from you and maybe just tell us like how you would define trauma.
Yeah, it's kind of like cool that you're talking about it from the body, like it lives in your body, because I think that's the part of like trauma and therapy people don't tune into, and they sort of like think about talk therapy as like this top down, like if you have insights, you're gonna feel better. But kind of thinking about it as like it's a full body experience. So I actually refer clients a lot to acupuncture too, and yoga and all these other things, because obviously all of my clients are trauma survivors, either be like they themselves have experienced sexual violence or someone they love has, and that in itself is a trauma, and it definitely like lives in their body. So the way that I define trauma, or the way that I've like learn to understand it, is like maybe different than the typical perspective sort of like in media. So I think we think of trauma as like an incident or event, or like if you look it up on, because I was kind of curious, I was like, how does Google define it? And it's just like a traumatic incident is like what they think of, like a car accident or things like that. But to me, trauma is how you respond to it, how you receive it, and how it impacts you. So the same two people could be in a car and get into an accident, and one person kind of walks away and it doesn't impact them, and the other person like has flashbacks, and every time they get in a car they see like lights coming at them, and so for one person it was like a really bad thing that happened to them, and for the other person it was a trauma. So it's sort of more around like, how does it impact you? And there are various ways it does, but that's sort of the way that I like to see it. Vanderkolk is like the big trauma therapist that I at least think about a lot. And his definition is like, trauma is often defined by the incident. However, I define trauma by its impact on a person. It's the current imprint of that pain, horror, and fear living inside people.
That's a good word, like an imprint, because it really is. And it really does affect like all aspects of your life and who you are. And it really, I think, becomes a part of your DNA, and it forever, right? It forever changes you. And I know they've done studies on this in terms of like studying, you know, the grandchildren and children of Holocaust survivors and how trauma has genetically altered their DNA in terms of like how they store glucose even, you know? So it physically does change your body, even if you think you're just thinking of the mind and the emotional game it's playing on you.
Yeah. And it's kind of interesting because like you're saying, it changes your DNA and now like you're changed forever, and it 100% does. And it's not like hopeless. It's not like, okay, it changes you and now you're permanently like damaged or traumatized, but like you might store things differently for some time. So there are like various ways that I see it play out, at least in my clients, is like it can change just your belief system, right? Like you start to believe like the world is unsafe, or like men are unsafe, or sex is unsafe, right? Like that's obviously coming up a lot in the clients that I meet with. But it can also just be, we have three main responses to something frightening that happens. So we have our fight, flight, and freeze response. And the way that it often sticks in our body is the way you responded. So if you experienced fight, it might be that anything that triggers that fight is like you get an elevated heart rate, or it's even that you're actually, especially when people have complex trauma where they have trauma happening over and over in their lives, they are actually like constantly kind of in that fight response, and like their heart rate is maybe always at a somewhat elevated, or they're always on guard, ready to like fight back. So those are the people who like maybe aren't even necessarily like volatile and always fighting, but they're sort of like ready, and they become
highly anxious person, typically very reactive.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I know I can like sometimes get a little technical.
So we all know people like this, you know, for good and bad. But that's interesting. So when you experience the trauma, that's what's usually going to stick with you until you kind of work through it.
Like you sort of see people stay in. I think the one that's most common actually, and at least spoken about, is the freeze response, and like that you actually like felt frozen, or you don't know how to like communicate or stop. And I actually find interesting, I don't know if it depends on the client. Sometimes it's freeze and sometimes it's what's called flight, but disassociation is the most common way that I see it in people, like living in people's bodies. And that's sort of like you leave the space. So when you're traumatized, especially if you were traumatized as a young child, you can't hold it, right? So you, instead of actually physically running away because you can't, you like run away. So you leave the room, like you leave your body. And so that is like the person who's like often like misses things or forgets things. And you're like, were you listening to me? And it's like, they wanted to be, but they can't because something you said made them leave this space, and they were on the ceiling the entire time you were talking.
Wow. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I like that because we always do hear about fight or flight, and freeze is definitely also something I can relate to. And I'm sure everyone has those moments, you know.
Right.
Like when I'm even just with friends socially and somebody says something jarring, you know, I totally freeze because I'm always so like caught off guard, you know, and then afterwards I'm always like, wait, why? I should have stood up for myself, or I should have said something. So we all freeze even in non-traumatic situations. Like, so it's interesting, definitely like to add that in because it's something we don't think about. So would you say people that you're seeing, I know it's probably a little bit more intense than what I see in my acupuncture clinic, but like on a smaller scale, I'll see just physically people who have gone through trauma, either they'll come in with their aches and pains and it's like everything is aching. So it's like, and my big toe and my stomach and it's like a laundry list of complaints. So their body, I think, is just right in that heightens like, oh my gosh, like they're holding so much. And a part of me thinks like, oh, is that also a distraction in a way from dealing with whatever psycho-emotional stuff is going on, too? Because they're anxious, but they're like, they can't talk about it because like they're of their big toe, you know?
Yeah.
And then I'll see other people who wouldn't be able to tell me, the last time they had a bowel movement, they just don't know. They're
Mhm.
just totally not in tune, but they just know something's wrong. So as practitioners, I guess we see so many different situations, but and we actually did, like, in our training, what are signs and symptoms that we can look for as healthcare providers to see if somebody is having or is a victim or experiencing trauma or domestic violence. And so I'm just plugging that because it's so important. Whether anybody shouldn't do the training, really. Something they should
Right.
teach everyone, I'm guessing. Obviously, so important. Because again, sometimes we might think that somebody's going through something, and we'll have the freeze response of like, "Oh, I'm not going to take action because, like, I don't know what to do, and I don't know if it's right or if I'm right, and we don't trust our guts." And so
Yeah.
it's like definitely complex. But so in terms of therapies, let's talk like solutions. um so uh, so if somebody here is listening and they know that they have had a trauma and that they probably need help, they probably haven't really fully worked through what they thought, or sometimes you go to therapy and you think that you've solved things, but then as life happens, new situations occur that are triggering, and so you probably want to revisit therapy. So
Mhm.
what are some of the things that you typically suggest to your patients? What type of therapies? I saw you do something called EMDR. Was that
Yeah.
it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, just
EMT.
tell us, like, what is all this stuff, and how, as a patient, whether we're helping a friend, a family member, or ourselves, like, how do we know to sort through all the noise of like what's out there?
Yeah. I think it's actually really hard. And I like that you asked me sort of that question. Is like friends will ask me all the time to just like read a therapist's bio because they're like, what do you think? And
Mm-hmm.
I think it's like, even if I'm reading it, I still might be like, I actually don't know. Like, it's really
Right.
hard to tell. Just one thing that I do always tell people is like, therapy's kind of like dating. And you don't, like, I think sometimes people think, like, okay, I went and now I have to stick with this person. It's like, no, you don't. Like, you can assess, you can decide, you
Mm-hmm.
can go on 3 dates um, and then leave. I want to make sure I put it in quotations because, like, also that's like totally unethical to actually date your clients.
Of
Um,
course.
but in terms of like what it has to be a good fit, and not every treatment modality and not every person is a good fit for every survivor.
Right.
Um, so like I like do different trainings and I try to learn different things about trauma because it's not a one size fits all. So like if somebody does choose to come in and they do see me, then there's different ways that I would want to address it for different people.
Yeah.
So I think like the first thing I would just like kind of like name, and I think is like something I really like feel like married to, is the YWCA where I work is a like a trauma informed care. Obviously we're seeing all trauma clients, but our overarching like mode of treatment is relational, so it all goes down to the relationship between the client and the therapist. And like having a healthy relationship with somebody is sometimes the first step to healing. um, and also on a personal level, right? So a friend tells you they're in a dangerous relationship, or they were assaulted, or they were assaulted as a child, the first thing, like, people are probably like, how do I respond to something like that? I'm not a
Right.
therapist. The first thing is you're a person and you just let them know you care. So the three things like we tell people in like trainings, who are volunteers, who respond in the hospital, is to let somebody know, I'm sorry this happened, I believe you, and it's not your fault.
Ooh,
Don't,
that's
not
really
telling
good.
somebody what to do, not giving them a solution, just like, I'm here for you and
Well,
I
I
got
feel like that's actually really good advice for all friendships and probably
you.
any relationship you're in. Because we're also, sometimes we're venting and the other person makes it worse by what they're saying, but really, probably that's all we want to hear. So, what
Right.
is it? I'm sorry that happened. I believe you.
And it's not your fault.
Not your fault. See, that's like, I feel like people would really, like, anybody would respond well to that. So,
Yeah, right. Like, it doesn't have to be traumatic.
right.
And then in particular, I think like so much shame goes with sexual violence where people really think it's their fault, like
Yeah.
so often.
Yeah.
So just reminding somebody, no matter how old you were, no matter where you were, no matter what choice you made, it's not your fault. And it
Yeah.
never is.
Yeah.
So it's like always starting with like the relationship.
Yeah. When I was in therapy for my trauma, they did exposure therapy and we did all sorts of things. Like I went to a specialized like organization that dealt with like victims of domestic violence and trauma. And so again, that would as the layperson, my recommendation
Right.
would be to make sure that that's the training your therapist has, because right, different therapists train in different things. So you want to go to a right therapist for the right issue is what I would say. But
Right.
we did this therapy where like I was afraid to go to Penn Station. And so they just made me go to Penn Station and that was that, you know?
Right.
And it was really just facing my fears head on. And I feel like that skill has stuck with me. So even in a really mundane, like ordinary sense of like, I'm nervous sometimes to like make a video, right? But like
Right.
I just do it anyway. I expose myself to it anyway. The therapies that I went through gave me lifelong skills. And like another one I'll say that I think was so important and impressionable for me was that I used to always talk in therapy and I would say, what do you think about that? Because I believed that it was my therapist's job to judge me and let me know if I'm like a good girl or a bad girl, like where I stand. And
Mm-hmm.
my therapist would say, why do you care what I think? What do you think?
Mm-hmm.
So again, like that's something that of course that's a practice because we all care too much what people think about us, but
Right.
that's definitely something that a great skill that I got from doing like the trauma therapy is exposing myself and believing in myself and my voice,
Mm-hmm.
recognizing this isn't my fault, I can move forward, and the only opinion that matters is my own,
For sure. Yeah. It sounds like you had a good therapist too. And like, I think I've met a beautiful therapist. I think most therapists I've met are good. Some aren't. Like,
Okay.
and so if you're like, just like in anything, right? Some doctors aren't good. Some OBs aren't good. So like, that's again back to the dating.
Yes, but it's the same right, in every profession, like for acupuncture, especially, there's a lot of different styles of acupuncture, and not every style is for every person. But the average person would have no idea. Like, they're
Right.
just going to Google acupuncture. Nobody would know that unless you're pretty much an acupuncturist.
Right.
And so often I'll have people come to tell me that acupuncture, they tried it once and it wasn't for them or it hurt them. I'm like, no, it's not about that. Like, you have
Right.
to find, and I say it's like therapy, like you have to find the right person for you. And I know I'm not the right practitioner for everybody either, right?
Right.
But yeah, so much of it is the game. So yeah, anybody listening who's on the fence about therapy or has had a bad experience, continue to go or seek the right person. Don't give up on it is the point. And again,
Yeah.
there's so many different styles out there as well.
Yeah, for sure.
PSA
Uh,
of the day.
yeah.
So you're telling your patients who have gone through trauma to do other alternative therapies. So let's say acupuncture is one. What are some other examples you can give us?
Yeah. I mean, I think it depends, but also like, let's say for a client who, it depends on also like what their response was, right? So a client who is struggling with, they had like a flight response and they sort of are always very jumpy, I might encourage them to run.
Hmm.
Or if they can't run, physically, to do some other activity that sort of stimulates that so that they're getting it out of their body and they're not running out of relationships.
Well, and also, I mean, that makes sense because a person like that wouldn't be able to do yoga, right? They wouldn't be able to do the lower impact or slower moving exercise. So that's, I think, really good advice is like meeting people where they are,
Mhm.
like they probably need to keep up their heart rate to feel safe at that point.
Right. Right. And it's like listening, learning, like who are you and what do you need?
Hmm.
Um, and I do think a lot of clients who are holding things in their body, I'm like, there's to recommend acupuncture and I like tell them about where you went to school because
Yes.
the program is free. So a lot of the clients are lower income or don't have, you know, insurance. And so I'm like, go to this school. Like I know it's some,
I'm so
students are great. They're really motivated.
I'm so glad you do that. So I'll just put a plug in here and I'll link to
Yeah.
it below. But my school, Pacific College of Oriental Medicine, is downtown Chicago on East Wacker Drive and has a student clinic. And you get really great care for, I don't know, it was like $15 a session or something. But such an amazing resource for anybody who feels like they can't afford acupuncture. definitely go to a school. Yes, there's, pros and cons to it, but you'll get great care. Every student there is supervised. So I'm really glad you're mentioning that. Yeah.
Yeah, like go to Zahava if you can.
But then also you can go, and also some acupuncturists like myself started accepting health insurance to also help people out. So, but again, the school is such a great option. I'm so happy to tell people to go there. And it's really good for the students to experience and learn how to work with different people who come from different backgrounds. We saw all sorts of cases there. So again, acupuncture is amazing work. When you feel like just completely out of sorts, the goal of acupuncture is to just recalibrate your nervous system and just let you settle. And the real key word here is balance. So when you're out of balance, acupuncture helps bring you into balance, whether that's physically, emotionally, spiritually, all together at once. So that's my plug, my acupuncture plug. I could talk about acupuncture all day.
I mean, I could talk about trauma all day, which is
right.
like maybe a weird thing, but
well, as friends, we've had a lot of conversations about this, which is why the main reason I really wanted to have you and interview you is because I just think that this is so important for everyone to know, that, whether you've dealt with trauma or somebody's dealing with trauma, that it can't be left alone is really the goal of what I wanted to get across, whether that's with an alternative therapy, going to a clinical social worker, a psychologist, whoever that is. But you can't just leave it. You'll deteriorate pretty much. You have to see somebody and take care of it. Not that you have to, but you should.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, thank you so much, Aviva, for being here. I feel like I've learned a lot. I'm going to link your information below if anybody has questions on how to find you, or the YWCA, and ask about their services too. Seems like an amazing place, though.
Yeah, it is. I feel very lucky and grateful to work somewhere that is sort of like the mission is exactly aligned with my beliefs around supporting women, supporting survivors, supporting their partners, supporting male survivors as well. And doing it with sort of this intentionality and thoughtfulness.
Beautiful. Well, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me, Zahava.
Of course. All right, we'll talk soon.
All right, bye.